Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Mark. Ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here. This is a wonderful forum, and I thank the City Club for doing this, not just for inviting me, but for what you do for all of us with this program. I do have to admit, having owned and operated a Honda Civic for 17 years, I thought that was quite an accomplishment, but it shrinks to insignificance in comparison to David's. So, the last time I was here, I felt it was important, I'll do it again, just to orient everyone about the alphabet soup that's associated with the laboratory and related activities. The Idaho National Laboratory is a government-owned, contractor-operated laboratory. I'm a contractor. We're hired by the Department of Energy to operate and maintain the laboratory in the nation's interests. The lab is about 4,000 people. The company that has the contract to operate it is the Battelle Energy Alliance, B-A-T-T-E-L-L-E, not to be confused with Bechtel. Bechtel's a wonderful company, but they're two very different institutions. Battelle is a nonprofit research and development institution with its home in Columbus, Ohio. So that's the lab, and that's about 4,000 people. There are three other major activities that go on at the 890 square miles we call the INL site. There are two contractors that are engaged in environmental cleanup work. The first is the Idaho Cleanup Project. The contractor that has that contract for the Department of Energy is CWI, which stands for CH2M Hill, and the Washington Division of URS. There's lots of acronyms here. And they're removing old reactor buildings, digging up materials that were disposed of in the soil and cleaning up the environment out at the lab site. The other is the Advanced Mixed Waste Treatment Project. The contractor that has that project is the Idaho Treatment Group, and that's a partnership of B&W, Babcock and Wilcox, URS again, and Energy Solutions. And their task is really to deal with a substantial amount of material that was primarily material from the Rocky Flats, Colorado weapons activities. It was piled up on a pad, boxes and drums in enormous quantities, and unearthing, characterizing, repackaging, and shipping that material out of the state. And the other activity out at the site is the Naval Reactors Facility, which is an independent, autonomous institution that supports the Navy's needs through a number of relationships. Bechtel does a lot of work for the Naval Reactors Facility, and so you'll see people from those organizations around here. As I said, the lab has about 4,000 people. When you add up all those other activities, they're between 3,000 and 4,000 more, so you're talking about a total of about 8,000 people that work out there for the Department of Energy. So I want to begin to talk about Fukushima 1 year later, and I like to begin any discussion of this by expressing both my condolences and my admiration for the Japanese people and the workers at the Fukushima site. As we go through the analysis and our understanding of what happened there, we are and we will be appropriately critical, but we have to remember that in the span of a very few minutes, the country of Japan, the citizens, the people of Japan lost 20,000 people, did enormous damage to their infrastructures. It laid waste areas where rice farming took place, and it won't be able to take place for a very long period of time afterwards. I mean, enormous damage. And then, oh, by the way, they had a severe nuclear accident as well. So they were operating under extraordinary conditions. The plants, the Fukushima site had 6 reactors. 3 were operating. They survived the earthquake just fine. They shut down. The tsunami was about 45 feet high when it hit that site. And so it inundated everything to a depth of at least 5 feet. So it moved tanks, big pieces of equipment. It just inundated and flooded the entire site and did that very quickly. They lost all backup power and the ability to forcefully cool the reactors. Reactors overheated. To prevent overpressurization, they released steam into the environment that carried with it a lot of radioactive gases and particles, because once the fuel is damaged, then you've lost the ability to contain it, contain the radioactive materials. They began pumping seawater in to cool it, and over a period of months, actually cooled the reactors down and got them in the condition they're in today. Now, the condition they're in today is they're still pumping water in. The reactors are cool enough so that the water is not boiling. Unfortunately, the primary containments have some leaks in them. They really don't know where all those leaks are, and so the water kind of leaks into the basement. So then they take a suction on the water in the basement, clean it up, and recycle it back into the reactors. The radiation levels around the reactors are so high, it's a very difficult proposition to get in there and figure out where the leaks are and plug them. But that's what they're about to do. The reactors are in a stable configuration, as stable as they can be without knowing, when the cores melt, they slump and they can break into pieces and fall into the bottom of the reactor vessel. But they for some number of months, have had control and stability there. If you think about the impacts of Fukushima, I think one of the first questions you have to ask is, well, what happened relative to radiation exposure? And there, first we look at the workers, and up till now there's been about 5,000 Japanese workers who have worked at the Fukushima site. Of those 5,000, about 250 exceeded the amount of radiation that we would allow workers to get in a year. There's well-established limits, and we know if we allow people to get that much exposure, there shouldn't be any increased risk to their long-term health or increased risk of cancer in particular. So 250 out of 5,000, and those all occurred in the months of April and May of last year when they were still trying to get things under control. Now, none of the exposures that the workers received are life-threatening. Of the 250 that exceeded what we would call a routine limit, there's about 52 that we would expect will have an increased risk of cancer over their lifetimes because of their exposure. Now, 45 of those 52 got an exposure that's about the same you get as if you're an astronaut and you go on an International Space Station mission. So when we send astronauts up there, they get a good dose of radiation. And we've decided, and they agree, that the risks associated with that exposure are acceptable given the benefits of their space travel. And there are about 7 of the 52 that got greater than you'd get on a space station mission, but again, none were life-threatening. The only deaths of workers at the Fukushima site were 2 workers who were killed by the tsunami. In the public, again, I think there's appropriately criticism of how the Japanese nuclear enterprise failed under these circumstances. And if I had to succinctly say it, I'd say that they failed to anticipate change. When those reactors were built, particularly the Americans that were involved, I bet couldn't even spell tsunami. And what happened over decades is we learned a lot. We learned a lot about earthquakes and uncertainties and the risks associated with them, and their system of owner, operator, government regulator, and other government responsibilities didn't recognize those changes, the new knowledge and changes, and adjust. I think there is evidence that the system in the United States does work better than that. But given that the system failed and the operators were presented with an extraordinary situation, I mean, think about it. The site you work on just got hit by a 45-foot wall of water. All the power poles are gone. There's debris everywhere. Your family lives in the village down the road, and you don't even know if they're alive. You have no lights, you have no instrumentation, no electrical power. You're hooking up car batteries to try to power the instrumentation. You get close to the reactors and it's hotter than hell and the radioactivity levels are very high. I mean, it's an extraordinary set of circumstances. So they responded, and the rest of Japan responded. They evacuated 80,000 people to protect them from radioactivity from the Fukushima accident. Now, about 10,000 of those were thought to have gotten potentially some significant radiation exposure, and thus far they've evaluated those 10,000. Of all of them, there's about 9,900 who the highest of anyone in that group got a dose that's equivalent to a X-ray or a mammogram. So certainly not life-threatening. And there are about 100 that got a dose that's the equivalent of some of the medical diagnostic techniques we use for bone and heart disorders or GI tract disorders that use radionuclides. So from the standpoint of the public and protecting the public from radiation, the Japanese, in my opinion, did quite well. Those members of the public that did get exposure got very small doses. No one got a dose that's equivalent to what a radiation worker gets. And again, we allow radiation workers to get exposure because we fully expect that it will have no impact on their long-term health or well-being. So there should not even be among the general public in Japan a measurable increase in the risk of cancer or other radiation-induced maladies. So from that respect and radiation exposure, I think the Japanese have done a good job managing it under extraordinary conditions. The status of the cleanup, and we've got some posters around here that may be of interest to you. There's some in the back that show some places in Japan right after the tsunami and today, and you'll see it's extraordinary what they've done. There's also a detailed timeline of the cleanup plan for the site and some background information on radiation exposure and how to interpret it. But relative to the site, the Japanese plan is to clean it up, clean it all up. So within the next 2 years, they expect to be pulling the fuel out of the spent fuel pools. Each one of the 3 damaged reactors has a spent fuel pool adjacent to it. And in the height of the casualty, there was a lot of speculation about perhaps these spent fuel pools had drained, the fuel had overheated and melted, and we were getting releases of radioactivity as a result of that. Well, it turns out that that never happened. That wasn't the case. That none of the fuel in the spent fuel pools was overheated or damaged. There's a lot of junk in the spent fuel pools from the hydrogen explosions that occurred. The chemistry's not what it should be because they dumped salt water in them to make sure they stayed full. But within the next 2 years, they'll start removing that fuel. Within the next 10 years, they'll get into the very difficult business of opening up each of the 3 damaged reactors, inspecting the damaged reactor cores, the core material, and then pulling it out. Of course, we have some experience with that, and we at the INL do because of the 3 Mile Island accident. They estimate that'll take them somewhere between 10 and 25 years. Knowing the Japanese, I expect that they'll do better than the plan and the schedule. And then after that, their plan is to knock down, completely demolish and dispose of the old reactor buildings, and they'll probably reuse that site for something else. In the surrounding countryside, there's an area about 20 miles by 40 miles, so it's about 800 square miles. It's about the size of the laboratory site that's contaminated primarily with cesium, contaminated to a level that you can't let people live there year-round. I mean, you can let people go in there, they'll get a radiation dose, it would be small, but it's high enough that you can't let them live there for a year continuously. And the Japanese are about cleaning that up, cutting vegetation, washing down buildings and roofs, removing topsoil, and they fully expect to reoccupy those areas. Of the 80,000 people that have evacuated, about 3/4 of them have stated an intention to return to their homes. The outside of that 800 square mile area, there's an area probably about 4 times that size. So this is big. I mean, they've got a real mess on their hands, where the contamination levels are lower. You could live there, but there are hot spots, and you know, prudence and practicality dictates that we ought to remove as much of that contamination as we can, and the Japanese are going about doing that as well. The impact of this accident on the Japanese and the Japanese nuclear industry has been profound. I think if you took a public opinion poll in Japan today, and some have been done, you'd find that about 80% of the people are opposed to nuclear energy. Japan had 54 reactors at 17 different sites, and the vast majority of them have been shut down. There's just a handful operating. Of course, the system's a little bit different in Japan. For example, to start up a reactor, if we were in Japan, I would have to get Mayor Furman's approval to start up our advanced test reactor. The local authorities have that authority within Japan. Now, having said that, at the reactor sites in Japan, a lot of money is being spent and a lot of work is being done to tsunami-proof them, to provide backup power supplies, to move things. The price of electricity is controlled by the government in Japan, so the cost of all this will be passed on to the citizens. But talking to the owners and operators of those sites, they anticipate restarting them. It'll be very interesting. We're going to see a real case study in Japan about how a country responds to the costs, risks, and environmental impacts of its energy choices. As was mentioned, the Japanese got about 25 to 30% of their electricity from nuclear energy. They can't import electricity from France or natural gas from the Ukraine or coal. They can import coal and petroleum at significant cost and environmental impacts. They're going to go through a process, an intensely political process, which is appropriate, of assessing what that means for them and their economic competitiveness, their quality of life, and again, the cost, risks, and environmental impacts of their choices. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see where they go over time in making that choice. In the U.S., the impact of Fukushima immediately was that the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the commercial nuclear industry in the United States evaluated the readiness of the reactors in the U.S. to withstand extended station blackouts, conditions of loss of electrical power for long periods of time. They looked at the recent records. Some of you may remember, last year the Fort Calhoun nuclear power station in Omaha was surrounded by water as a result of flooding of the Missouri River. We've had reactors in the United States that have withstood earthquakes, hurricanes. The result of the review by the NRC and the industry was that there are some things that needed to be done, but the reactors were safe. Their continued operation did not present an imminent risk to public health and safety, and so none of them were shut down, not one. There are about 23 reactors in the U.S. today that look very much like the Japanese reactors at Fukushima. In the rest of the world, the principal impact was in Germany and Switzerland, where there was a decision to denuclearize. Again, unlike the Japanese, the Germans can import nuclear-generated electricity from France or natural gas from the Ukraine. They have some more flexibility and choice, but they have the same choice to make. What are the costs, risks, and environmental impacts of our energy sources? What are their impacts on our economic competitiveness and our quality of life? And I think the Germans will be an interesting case study over time as well. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, certainly in China, certainly in India, certainly in Korea, they've evaluated the lessons learned from Fukushima, and they're moving forward. They've made the choice. They think and assessing the cost, risks, and environmental impacts that nuclear energy remains an extraordinarily important part of their energy infrastructure, and they're continuing an aggressive expansion of the use of nuclear energy. This is a short summary of the status of nuclear energy in the U.S. and around the world. And you can see in the U.S. there are 104 operating reactors that provide 20% of our electricity, about 70% of our carbon-free electricity. And it shows 5 units under construction and about 20 planned. The 5 under construction, there are actually 4 brand new reactors, 2 in Georgia and 2 in South Carolina. The 5th one is a Tennessee reactor that was partially completed decades ago, and the Tennessee Valley Authority decided that they're going to complete that reactor and put it into operation. The 20 planned, the 20 is a serious number because it's associated with a site that's been identified for the reactor, so it's not just somebody's wish. You can see how that fits in the rest of the world. 434 reactors, 14% of the world's electrical supply is nuclear, and 65 new reactors under construction, and about 156 that are in the works. There's serious work to build those reactors. If I try to summarize the factors for change relative to nuclear energy, first of all, outside the United States, it's very clear. It's concern over carbon, that's a big one, and it's the cost of energy and what that means for our economic competitiveness, given the choices. A big factor for China, for India, is they feel in order to accomplish what they need to accomplish within their countries, they've got to have a large, abundant energy source. I asked a utility person one time who owned a utility, was responsible for a utility that owned all kinds of generation, gas, coal, nuclear. I asked him why he liked nuclear energy, and he said because it's big, it's economic, and it's real. And I think that's reflected in the positions of a significant number of people outside the United States. But within the U.S., there are some things that are helpful. As I said, 4 new plants under construction in 2 states, and a 5th completion of a plant that was started a long time ago. Since Fukushima, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has continued to extend the licenses of our operating reactors. Remember, they were built and licensed initially for 40 years. They're almost every one of them now is being extended to 60 years. So post-Fukushima, that continues to move forward. The Blue Ribbon Commission, which John Kotek will talk to you about, is looking essentially at what should the United States do without Yucca Mountain. What's the plan for used fuel and high-level waste disposition? And as I mentioned, post-Fukushima, the assessment by the most highly regarded regulatory authority in the world is that U.S. reactors are safe. So those are all helpful things. On the not-so-helpful side, number 1 is below natural gas price and anticipated very large supply. And let me be clear, I think the United States is extraordinarily blessed with this natural gas supply. But I also think we have to be careful not to treat it as the drug of choice and ignore the long term and not think about the costs, risks, and environmental impacts, opportunities, and advantages that come with that extraordinarily important resource. The financial turmoil and recession has a huge impact on nuclear energy. Nuclear energy requires a big upfront capital investment, and what you get for that is, reasonably speaking, you get a power plant that should last for about 100 years, and you get a very stable price of electricity from that plant because the fuel is plentiful, the price of it is stable, and the fuel price represents a very small part of the operating costs of a reactor. It's almost the opposite with natural gas. The issue with natural gas is what's its price today and what's it going to be tomorrow. And of course, it's carbon-free electricity. With nuclear and natural gas, if carbon is your concern, it's half again better than coal. It's half the carbon of coal, but it's still carbon. Fukushima's impacts on public opinion and the cost of related regulations. Obviously, there are people who, post-Fukushima, no longer feel like it's worth the risks in the United States and in places around the world. And there will be increased costs, regulatory costs, associated with implementing changes to our plants, extra power supplies, moving some components, so that they're ready for really unthinkable kinds of accidents. What happens if we have a flooding problem that's really started with an earthquake and then results in a fire? What's that look like? And what kind of redundancy and flexibility do I need to be able to do with that and ensure that we protect the public health and safety? NRC uncertainty is it's a difficult one to talk about, but it's very real. The 5 commissioners of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which is intended to be an independent, non-political regulatory authority whose task it is to protect public health and safety, and I won't point fingers, but they've engaged in a dialogue and debate in the Senate, in the House, in public, that if you stand back from it, you say, what's going on here? These people are responsible for protecting public health and safety. And they hold a vote on the first new nuclear reactor to be built in the United States in 30 years, and the chairman of the commission votes no. What does that mean? Does that mean I, as a member of the general public, should think there's one of these regulators that thinks it's unsafe to build those reactors in Georgia? What the heck is going on? It's not a good situation, but it's appropriate for people to be concerned about it. And I think certainly within the industry, it creates uncertainty and additional risk. The fact that we don't put a price on carbon in the United States is a disadvantage to nuclear energy. Extraordinarily important, I think, is the lack of a long-term view. If all you care about is the short-term and short-term economics and you're in the electricity business, I would argue you'd have to be a fool to build anything but gas. Low upfront capital costs, start making money right away. What's the price of natural gas going to be 10 years from now? I don't know about that, but we'll deal with that when it comes. If you're in the nuclear business, you got to be in it for the long term, and you got to think long term. And it's not that our entire electrical supply needs to be nuclear, but I think it's a mistake if it's not part of our portfolio. And again, you got to have a long-term view to be in the nuclear business. And last but not least, romanticizing and demonizing technology. It's always been fashionable to demonize nuclear. Now it's fashionable to demonize coal. It's always been fashionable to romanticize renewables. In my opinion, we need to make our decisions on a basis that's much sounder than that. All large-scale energy sources have costs, risks, and environmental impacts, period. And until we start assessing them that way and understanding that, and understanding the uncertainties associated with them, if we continue to romanticize and demonize, we're just going to make bad choices. So those, I think, are the factors influencing nuclear energy in the U.S. today. As some of you know, Governor Otter created earlier this year, created a Leadership in Nuclear Energy Commission. Its task is, as shown here, to make recommendations to the governor on policies and actions of the state to support and enhance the long-term viability and mission relevance of the INL. The commission was formed in January and submits its report in January of next year. And their tasks are to identify opportunities for research capabilities at the lab, review Idaho's efforts to provide a nuclear workforce, identify long-term issues relating to operations at the lab, identifying opportunities and investments in the Center for Advanced Energy Studies, identify infrastructure needs, and review the Blue Ribbon Commission results and roles and opportunities for the advancement of R&D at the lab, while respecting the state's long-term position not to become a nuclear repository. From my position as lab director, of course, I'm very excited about this. I think it's an opportunity for the state leadership and indeed all the citizens of Idaho to consider the burdens and benefits of being the home of the Idaho National Laboratory. The burdens and benefits of being leaders in the United States and leaders in the world in a technology that has an important role to play in the future of mankind. And the timing is perfect. The timing is perfect because of the Blue Ribbon Commission results, which create a path forward on what we do with used fuel. It's perfect because of the completion of the cleanup activities at the lab, which are going to be coming to a close here in just a very few years. And I think it's perfect timing as well because we in the United States are wrestling with our future economic competitiveness, what that means, how we sustain it, and of course our energy sources play a very big part in that. And I also think it's the perfect timing because around the world people are grappling with the issue of the world's energy supply. We live in an energy-starved world. There are about 1.6 billion people without electricity. So cleaning up things here in the United States and getting our own house in order is a necessary thing, but it's certainly not going to address the worldwide challenge. And what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about the hundreds of millions of people who seek to have a lifestyle somewhat like we do, which is energy intense, and if you look at the whole size of the population of the planet, unsustainable. Well, we're not going to fix that in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years, but we have to get on a path that makes sense. And I think increasingly the world is aware of that, and the role that nuclear energy will play in that is, in my opinion, very important and very significant. On the agenda, and I did want to talk about laboratory funding and the prospects for this. And this is actually a slide I presented to all the employees. And let me explain it. Certainly, if you look at 2013 and beyond, there's extraordinary uncertainty. And the big issue is the federal budget. Super committee failed. We should have mandatory spending caps implemented in 2013, and because there's, even with those spending caps, there's not enough deficit reduction. If Congress doesn't do something, we're going to get sequestration. So what does all that mean? In 2012, this year, our budget is about $930 million. The President's budget request, remember it's a request, he submits that to Congress, for 2013 is about a 10% reduction. If caps and sequestration kick in as best we can estimate them for 2014 and 2015, you're talking on the order of a 20% reduction. So directs and indirects are the way we talk about. Directs are the people doing real research work. Indirects are the ones, the essential elements of support personnel that make the research possible. And we talk about them in terms of FTEs, full-time equivalents, which you can kind of think of as a person, but that's not quite right. An FTE is a number of hours worked in a year. So if you reduce that to numbers, you know, the hard and difficult truth is we could be facing as much as a 300 to a 600 full-time equivalent reduction. And that's a huge issue of a group of 4,000 people engaged in the complexity of the things we do. You just don't peanut butter spread a cut of that magnitude across the institution. You have to change it substantially and change some of its capabilities. So that's the uncertainty that we're facing. It's not just the INL and our institution that's facing this. Every federally funded institution is facing similar uncertainties and challenges. And it seems to all be on hold waiting. I think there's a campaign and election in the works. But that's what it is. Of course, you know, within the lab, I mean, we don't sit idle during these or any other times. It's very important. We are a capability machine, and if we're going to have a future, we have to continue to invest in capabilities that we think will solve important problems and that the country will need. And so if you look out the window over here, there's two new buildings under construction. One of them is for our biofuels, our battery, and our hybrid energy systems work, so we can get some of that stuff out of parking lots and other places they were doing it and put it in an appropriate facility. That's called our Energy Systems Lab, and that's the outside of it is just about finished. And then there's a big hole over there that's going to be the Research and Education Lab, which allows us to consolidate some of our facilities here in town and really put them under an appropriate roof. That's the buildings part of it. The most important part of our capability is our people, and we're going to continue to seek out the best and brightest in areas that are impactful to the nation's needs. We'll continue to pursue appropriate work. The Blue Ribbon Commission may create some work for us. Certainly, there's important things we can do to help the Japanese in their recovery. Our national homeland security and energy and environmental work, the work outside of our nuclear portfolio, will continue to serve national needs there. But remember, we're a nuclear energy lab. That's the reason we exist. These missions are important, but they are secondary to the nuclear mission, and they're limited in their size, as is appropriate. Of course, we'll emphasize the value to the Department of Energy of concentrating the resources they have in Idaho, given our reputation, our demonstrated success at technical integration, which means give us the R&D task and we'll get the people and the capabilities from labs, universities around the country to solve the problem. And last but not least, we continue to support and participate in and lead efforts that encourage a long-term view, and the Line Commission is one of those. There are 3 efforts ongoing in Washington related to nuclear energy led by think tanks and policy organizations, which I find extraordinary. I mean, I've never seen that happen before. One is led by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. One is led by the Bipartisan Policy Center. And the third is led by the New Millennium Nuclear Energy Partnership. So there's certainly opportunity there to get a focus on the long-term view and the future of nuclear energy in our country. And last but not least, the Department of Energy has a process that was initiated to essentially develop an energy strategy. It starts with a technology review and then ends with an every 4-year energy review. So those things can all be helpful. So that concludes my formal remarks. Thank you very much for doing this. Thanks for the opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, John, for that overview and your insights into the future of nuclear energy. We've got here a number of diverse and fascinating questions from your audience. Let's stay for a moment on the international front. You made some interesting comments about the Japanese efforts to contain the damage. So, in your view, how would we distinguish the safety standards that were in place in Japan at the time, as opposed to the new safety standards that may be implemented in Japan, and how those compare with U.S. safety standards?
Yeah, I think the best, the easiest way to answer that is that in the United States, for a number of reasons, but certainly September 11th was a big one. We looked at the commercial industry, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission looked at the operations of our plants, their vulnerabilities, and said, okay, let's think fundamentally. They said, let's think outside the box. What if we have an airplane that's hijacked and we crash it into a nuclear power plant? I mean, that had been thought of before and addressed before. But what if we have an insider who turns out to be in cahoots with somebody, and their goal is, they're terrorists, and their goal is to blow the plant up, create a environmental issue, and to have an impact for whatever purpose. So there was a lot of, I'll just call it out-of-the-box thinking about what could go wrong, and then as a result of that, capabilities were added in terms of backup power supplies, backup cooling. So if the worst things happen, here's what we can do. And we can't predict, exactly what all those worst things could be, so let's just have flexibility. I think because of that, and because our enterprise, in particular the interaction between the regulators and the industry, worked well, I think we adapted better than the Japanese did. I think they kind of sat, and again, I'm very reluctant to be critical of them, except in the context from which we can learn from it, but fundamentally I think they had their feet kind of in concrete on some of these issues, and so they didn't adapt. And when you operate a technology like that, you don't learn. And let me just point out one difference that's in the United States. In fact, I think it's really unique in the world that advantages our system. All the owners of commercial nuclear power plants in the United States belong to an organization that they created called the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations. And they basically inspect the plants every year and they give them grades. And here's the deal. If you own one of those plants, you're part of a team. And if the team's inspectors come around and they look at your plant and they find you wanting, then we all sit down together and we say, you're not doing your part. And if you don't listen, CEO, the rest of the members of the team are going to go to your board of directors and say, your CEO isn't doing his job and he's putting the rest of this capability for the country at risk. So that's a very powerful tool in the U.S. that the Japanese don't have. It's very difficult to imagine it fitting in their culture. And part of the challenge is we have to take the way we see things and explain them and understand them, and then we can help the Japanese figure out how that works in their culture. You know, you can have the block diagrams and organizations and all that, but that's not it. You've got to have the ability to question authority, the ability to adapt and challenge engineering solutions, and an extraordinarily deep questioning attitude. The Japanese are terrific engineers, but they failed to adapt. Their enterprise failed to adapt and recognize change, and in my opinion, that's fundamentally what got them in trouble. And the adaptations that you're seeing, you can see in Japan now, is what we've already done to some extent in the United States. I mean, where it's appropriate, they're building big tsunami walls, they're bringing in portable power supplies, so you know, there's not going to be people hooking up car batteries. There's going to be trucks with batteries, and you know, we can respond to just about anything. So it's those kinds of things. Over the longer term, there'll certainly be a look around the world at different reactor technologies, primarily the fuel, that, and the buzzwords is more accident tolerant. But there's interest in that. There always has been. But it's not an easy problem. And safety is relative and risk is never zero. And if the plants, by all means we can measure, are really, really, really safe, there's no silver bullet out there with the promise of making them, you know, perfectly safe. If it's incrementally safer enough that it's worth it, it's worth the costs and risks to do it, then we may see, and not in any short order, because this is a difficult thing to do, you know, a different type of reactor fuel, or potentially in the long-term future, a different reactor technology, because the incremental improvements in safety are so convincing to us. But there's nothing like that on the shelf today.
Thank you. And let's turn our attention to I&L for a moment and ask about the safety features that have been developed at I&L to forfend perhaps the impact of an earthquake or another catastrophic disaster.
Yeah, of course, we operate 3 reactors and 2 spent fuel pools at the lab. They're, of course, all seismically designed, and we review seismic designs about every 10 years in this country. And what happens is you always learn something. And so you always go back and sharpen the pencil and say, ooh, did we estimate this risk well enough? And we're going through that process now. The reactors, the big one, of course, has a seismic scram on it. It'll shut down if there's a event of seismic significance. The geology at the site is such that even though Mount Bora, there's some active sites here, and this is actually a quite active earthquake area, the place where the lab is seismically isolated. It's kind of, the type of structure out there results in somewhat of a, the best way to think about it is a shock absorber. The hazards and risks are far different than they are with a commercial power plant. One fuel module on a commercial power plant is the equivalent of all the material in our entire reactor. Their fuel is thicker. Ours is in very thin plates, so ours cools very rapidly and doesn't need forced cooling for anywhere near the time that commercial power plants do. It's operated at basically hot water heater temperatures and very low pressures, so there's not the same mechanism for expelling steam. And there are backup systems in terms of electrical power supplies, a number of backup generators and ways to get fuel to those generators, as well as enormous fresh water sources to ensure that if the worst thing happens, that we can keep the fuel covered with water so that it doesn't melt. And as long as the fuel doesn't melt, then the radioactivity in it will be effectively contained. And we try to look at everything, believe it or not. I mean, we assess what happens if the Mackey Dam fails. When will the flood reach us and what the implications are of that? So, and these kind of things, you know, the best attitude and the best approach is always to stay a little off balance and humble about whether or not you think you've got it all figured out, because the day you think you do, you no longer do. And I think we do a pretty good job at that. And we invite outsiders in and get outside criticism. We just had a group this week from the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations who we try to translate what they do in the commercial nuclear industry to ours. So I think we're doing all the right things.
Remaining on the international front for a moment, you mentioned that a number of countries have reacted in different ways to the Fukushima disaster. What about Germany's stance now on nuclear energy, and do you expect that Germany might reverse course?
Yeah, you know, the German response has been to denuclearize Germany. That is clearly the current political consensus. Now, what it's got to come to grips with is now what are the costs, risks, and environmental impacts of implementing that decision. And that will take place over a longer period of time than the election cycle, and we'll see. And much like Japan, although the Japanese are in a more difficult situation because they don't have a lot of choices. They don't have the same choices as the Germans do. They're going to assess if we change our energy infrastructure from nuclear to these others, are we going to be happy with that? 10, 20, 50 years from now, are we better off in terms of the impact on the environment of our where we get our energy? Our energy infrastructure's impact on our economic competitiveness and the quality of life. What's that mean? So, for example, if you're a German manufacturer and this change in energy infrastructure in Germany is going to significantly disadvantage you relative to your competitors, then I expect that that German manufacturer would make his or her concerns known. And I think that process has to play out. And it will play out differently and at different speeds because of very different political processes in both Germany and Japan. But I think both of them are very good case studies that we as Americans can learn from.
On a number of bases, Americans have been very, very concerned about China in recent years, foreign policy, energy, and other economic issues. What is the state of nuclear energy in China in terms of how many nuclear reactors are currently in business and any planned reactors?
Yeah, the Chinese today have about 14 nuclear reactors. By and large, they're turnkey operations from around the world. This is John's description. The Chinese went shopping, and they wanted a sample of French technology, Russian technology, American technology, Canadian technology, to see what they thought. They have chosen a Westinghouse reactor, the Westinghouse AP1000, And remember, it's Westinghouse Toshiba. And they have plans for, they have at least, and I haven't looked at it in recent days, but at least 20 reactors under construction. And they have enormous ambitions relative to the expansion of nuclear energy. The deal with Westinghouse Toshiba on this reactor is a complete technology transfer. So the contract means that there are going to be 4 reactors of this kind built in China, and all the technological insight and intellectual property associated with them is part of the deal. And the Japanese or the Chinese have already built one factory, and I think they may have the other one under construction, or it may be even finished now, to manufacture the modules for these reactors so they can populate their country with them. Because again, to them, you know, they've got millions of people who don't even have electricity. It's all about lifting their people out of poverty, giving them opportunity, and making them economically competitive. Their industries aren't competitive without a competitive energy source. Think about that. Do we ever talk about that in this country? So they're off to do that, and they're off to do it in a very big way. They're fully committed, and I think they have in mind not only when they populate their country with well over 100, perhaps significantly more than that, of these reactors, to, you know, my language for it is to make them the Volkswagen of the nuclear world, that then they're going to sell them around the world as a product, as an export product. So they're committed in a very big way. The Indians are as well. The Indians, because of really historical reasons in the Cold War and being isolated in the Cold War, developed their own indigenous capability. But they look at the choices and they say, if we're going to lift our people out of poverty and provide a decent quality of life and an opportunity for our country and its economic competitiveness, we cannot do it without substantial investments in nuclear energy, and so they're off to do it.
Thank you. Turning back to the Idaho lab for a moment, some years ago, as you'll recall, the then Secretary of Energy characterized the Idaho lab as the lead lab for nuclear energy in America. Some people believe that other energy labs, nuclear energy labs around the country didn't quite get that memo. So, what programs and initiatives are there ongoing at our lab that would help to fulfill the premise and promise of that title?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, you know you're the leader nationally and internationally when everyone else thinks you are and you don't. That's part of being successful at that. The first thing you have to do is you have to get the right people. And when I look at people like Dr. Dave Hill, Dr. Philip Fink, Dr. Kamal Paseme Matoglu, I love that name. You know, we've got some of the best leaders in the country. There are some people of similar quality in some other laboratories, but I think we have the concentration of them here. So when I think about that issue, I think about leadership means that we have to have the capabilities that allow us to lead, and that's first and foremost the right people, and I think we've got them here and we continue to hunt for them. The second thing we do is we behave as leaders, and that is, from a technical perspective, what's the task? What is it that the country needs done? Now, what's the best way to do that? If that means some of the work goes to Oak Ridge or any of the other laboratories because it's the best way to get it done, then that's the way to do it. Not try to bring infrastructures and capabilities to Idaho that already exists somewhere else. And the third part of that is this isn't our creation, it's actually our blessing, is that we have facilities here that are like no others in the country or in the world. So there are other laboratories that can say, well, we'd really like to do that work, but the answer is they don't have the advanced test reactor, or they don't have the hot fuel examination facility, which is an enormously significant hot cell where you can work on full-size commercial fuel elements. And these are infrastructures that cost billions of dollars. And we're fortunate that they were built here, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, and they're still capable and relevant, and other laboratories don't have them. And last but not least, you know, we have a state, we have a community that's extraordinarily supportive of the laboratory and its mission. I think we have a group of informed citizens who understand the risks and the benefits associated with being the home of the lab, and they're supportive of that. And that's not true at some of these other places. And I'll just give you one example. There are 3 states in the United States that house the major DOE nuclear facilities and burdens, used fuel, and high-level waste associated with activities in the past. And they're Washington, Idaho, and South Carolina. Now, of those 3, 2 of them are suing the federal government over the Yucca Mountain decision, and Idaho is not one of those. So it's different here, and I think that makes a huge difference.
Thank you.
And it's a competitive advantage.
Right. Thank you, John. We're running out of time, so a couple of quick questions related to some very detailed questions here. Can you give us any news on the issue of the development of thorium nuclear reactors, and what's the latest on small modular reactor design? Okay,
thorium, the Indians are pursuing a thorium fuel cycle. For future thought, Idaho has a lot of thorium in the state, but the bottom line is that the advantages of thorium fuel the advantages and disadvantages are not, the advantages aren't significant enough to change from a uranium fuel cycle in the near term, both in the United States and around the world. For the long term, we're going to use that thorium, but there's no incentive for such a significant change in infrastructures and capabilities from uranium, either here or anywhere else in the world. The Indians have a lot of thorium, but they may find over time that it's better to be like everyone else and stick to a uranium fuel cycle. Small modular reactors, of course, the promise is let's build small reactors that don't cost $6 to $8 billion. They cost maybe $2 billion, and they're not big 1,500 megawatt generators that now you got to have a market that consumes 1,500 megawatts 24 hours a day. Let's build them in like 300 or 400 or 500 megawatt increments, and then we can add generating capacity as the demand increases. That's the promise. And the promise of small modular reactors is that because they're small and modular, you can build components in a factory, you get higher quality control, it's less expensive, that the economies of being small and modular will overcome economies of scale. We build big nuclear reactors because our experience has been the small ones cost you just as much as the big ones. So why would you pay the same amount for 500 megawatts when you can get 1,500 megawatts? And so particularly with the financing issues, you know, the question is a real one. The opportunity is significant, and the Department of Energy is going to resource industry licensing efforts to try and see if one or two of these small modular reactor technologies can be commercialized, can be built, you know, somewhere in the country. I will say, from the standpoint of Idaho, if it's existing technology and it's ready to be commercialized, there's really no reason to build one at the lab. And who would pay for it? A small modular reactor makes sense at the Idaho National Laboratory if it's a new technology, if it's a sodium-cooled fast reactor, if it's different from the water reactor technologies that we're trying to get deployed in the country today to see if the economies of modularity can overcome economies of scale. So it's in the works.
John, you mentioned the importance of the Governor's Line Commission. Do you know if the general public will have the opportunity to provide some input into those recommendations?
Yeah, I do. I've participated in the first meeting, and one of the principles is that the public are invited to the meetings and they're given a chance to comment. And certainly special interest groups and public interest groups that have an interest in the subject will be invited and given some time on the Commission's schedule.
One last question. You mentioned the benefits and burdens of having a lab in our backyard, and you mentioned the great impact that the lab has on our local economy. What can the city of Idaho Falls do to promote the success of the Idaho National Laboratory?
Wow. I think keep doing what you're doing, stay engaged and informed, and express your opinions about the what goes on out there. I think that's most important. An engaged, informed public and citizenry here is critical to confidence in what we do. And, you know, and we're not, you know, we're 4,000 people that do a lot of hazardous things every day. And we are not perfect. People make mistakes, machines break. The key is that we have all the disciplines in place that when those things happen, public health and safety is never an issue, never an issue. And we have to be open enough and you have to be interested enough to underwrite that confidence. We can't buy it, we can't command it from you. We have to do our part and you have to do yours. And so that's what I would encourage you to do. Question us, probe, visit, challenge us, and ensure that we continue to earn your confidence in the work that we do and the role that we play.
We will continue this dialogue on many fronts for our May 19 program with John Kotek. In the meantime, let's give a warm round of applause. Thank you, John, for